Hello and welcome to another entry in the Astrologer's Encyclopedia. My name is Matt. Thank you so much for joining me. I am in a different room today and I don't have my usual microphone set up because my apartment has a pretty bad mold infestation. So just had eclipses in the fourth, and there's like part of my bathtub is not sealed correctly to the wall. There's been water pouring into it for a year and a half. And I told my landlord right when I moved in and he just didn't do anything. So now there's like mold eating through the wall and it made me sick. So we are staying at my girlfriend's parents' house for the time being, hopefully not too long. So anyway, we are going to be talking about Saturn today. This is going to be the final of my planetary videos for now. Eventually, I will get to Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, probably eventually even do asteroids. But I don't think my background in modern astrology is quite strong enough yet to do like a really thorough treatment of them in the same way that it is for the first 7 planets. So I think what we're going to do is my next video will probably be on the triplicity lords of the sect light, which is just a very general timing technique, divides the life into 2 or 3 parts. And then after that, I think we're going to go through a couple of celebrity charts. I can't remember if I said this in the Jupiter video or not, but that's what we're going to do, start to tie everything sort of together that we've been doing thus far. So just very quickly, if you want to support the channel, I do have a Patreon. You can get weekly forecasts, like written, a couple page forecasts for $3 a month, early access to new videos for $5, bonus monthly forecast video for 10, and there's a couple higher tiers as well that you can check out if you are interested. So without any further ado, let's hop into the talk. If it will let me open the slideshow. Cool. So like I said, today we're going to be talking about Saturn. Saturn is the last visible planet. There's usually about 1 day per year or so that you can see Uranus in the sky very dimly, usually when it's opposite the sun. And I'm not even sure if that happens every year. I know it did like this year, like this October when the sun was in Scorpio and Uranus obviously is in Taurus. So quick table of contents. We have our usual traditional sources, Saturn traditional astrology, modern sources, same ones as always. And then for some reason I didn't write this, we are going to do a quick sum up of Saturn and modern astrology, talk very briefly about the Saturn return, and then have the works cited page as always. So starting off with Valence, he says, the star of Saturn makes those born under him petty, malicious, which by the way is me, Aquarius rising, petty, malicious, having many anxieties, those who bring themselves down, solitary, deceitful, those who conceal their deceit, austere, downcast, those who have a feigned appearance, squalid, clothed in black, importunate, which I can't remember what that means, sullen, excuse me, miserable, given to seafaring. This is another interesting one. Practicing waterside trades, and he causes depressions, sluggishness, inaction, obstacles in undertakings, long-lasting punishments, subversion of matters, secrets, restraints, imprisonment, sorrows, accusations, tears, being orphaned, captivity, exposures. He makes farmers, gardeners, because he rules the soil. He also produces those who acquire great reputation, notable rank, guardianships, the administration of that which belongs to others, and the fathers of other people's children. Of substances, he rules lead, wood, and stone. Of parts of the body, he rules the legs, the knees, the tendons, the watery parts of the body, phlegm, the bladder, the kidneys, and the inner parts that are hidden. Of illnesses, he is indicative of those that arise from coldness and moisture, such as dropsy, pain in the tendons, gout, cough, dysentery, tumors, and convulsions. Of disorders, it indicates spirit possessions, unnatural lusts, and depravity. He makes those who are unmarried and widowed, orphans, and childlessness. He brings about violent deaths by water or by strangulation or through imprisonment or from dysentery. And he causes falls on one's face. He is the star of Nemesis and of the diurnal sect. He is dark brown in color and astringent in taste. So we see a couple of interesting sort of threads here. So Saturn is things that are kind of mean, right? Petty, malicious, but also like fearful, um, and things that like drag themselves down, things that are alone, things that are dark, things that are deceptive, things that are like unclear. And so a lot of this comes from Saturn being positioned opposite the luminaries in the theme of Monday. So that in turn comes from Saturn being like the furthest and the slowest and the dimmest planet. So you have all these things of like, if the sun is like truth and visibility and awareness and like royalty and all these things, and the moon is like mothers and the health of the body and like communities and these kinds of things, Saturn represents the direct opposite. So Saturn is things that are unclear, deceitful, untrue, solitary, so like not related to other people or other things, is malicious rather than like noble and pure, fearful rather than courageous, austere rather than generous, right, with the moon. And then so there's this general like darkness, heaviness, sadness, grief, right, related with Saturn. Some really interesting ones. My favorite, I think, significations would be given to seafaring and practicing waterside trades. And so this is just like my own life. So I have Aquarius rising, and then I have Saturn with um, Mars in Aries in the third, Mars rules the 10th. And so for my job for a very, very long time, I was a lifeguard and I taught swimming. So I would drive up, and I had a red car at one point. I would drive up in my red car, all decked out in red. I had my red bag, and this is before I knew any astrology. So I'm showing up in the clothes of Mars, right, and doing a Saturn job, right? So a waterside trade. And then in addition, given to seafaring was I was a rower and I was a swimmer in school. So that's hilarious to me, right? So just going further, again, it's like this heaviness, this darkness, this depression, inaction, slowness, and then also sort of like this lowliness and this outcast nature. So again, if we think of the sun and the moon as being like the royalty, the in crowd, people who are included, people who are select, right? Saturn is people or things that are cast out, that are marginalized, right? So Saturn is at the very edge, is on the margin. And so he will indicate people or things, right? So like babies who are exposed. This is what exposures mean. They would take unwanted children, oftentimes like disabled children, and just put them outside. And if someone wanted them, they would take them. If they didn't, they would just die. So also things like orphans, farmers and gardeners. So like lowly, quote unquote, occupations. So like people who don't have lots of political influence, people who are very like common, like you're like salt of the earth type of people. But it's also interesting, he produces those who acquire great reputation, notable rank, and guardianships, but it's usually through someone else giving it to them. It's not usually like through their own right. So you'll see like the administration of that which belongs to others and the father of other people's children. So it's this like status by proxy, or like this status that's given through someone else. And so you would see like Jupiter being like a father or a judge or a priest or something like that, whereas Saturn would be like someone's accountant or someone's administrator or someone else's, like the father of someone else's children, those kinds of things. So I think that's probably good for balance. So now moving on to Firmicus. So Firmicus was a Roman lawyer writing in like the 300s or 400s, I think the 4th century, so that would be the 300s. Says Saturn partilely, so by degree, he goes on to say that, partilely posited in the ascendant by day, i.e., if he has in that very degree in which the ascendant is, if he is in that very degree in which the ascendant is, tongue twister, will make the birth to occur with a very loud outcry. Moreover, the native will be older than all of his brothers, or if one of them was born before him, that one will be separated from his parents. For always when this god is posited by day in any of the 4 angles, he will make the native to be the firstborn or the first to be reared, or those brothers who were born before him to be killed. He makes lofty individuals and those lifted up by a spirit of arrogance. So this is an angular Saturn by day. So Saturn is a daytime planet. So if he's in a day chart, he's of sex, so he's going to be more able and willing to produce good outcomes. So this is like the birth to occur with a very loud outcry. I think this means that it's like a violent birth or a difficult birth or like a deadly birth, but one that's not like easy. So that's, even though it's during the day, it's still a malefic, it still produces difficulties. And then it makes him the oldest brother, so it gives him some sort of status, but like it says, often through one of the brothers dying or one of them being separated. So just very interesting. It's very similar to what Firmicus would say about Jupiter in the first house, if you saw the last video. But if Saturn is posited in the ascendant degree by night, whoever has him thus is hampered by the greatest weakness, and he is always oppressed by much toil. And to some it will give activities around water, but in such a way that the natives are always worn out by tedious work. So I really include this to just illustrate the difference in sex status between planets. So there's something that I kind of rail against in these videos is that sometimes in modern astrology, people are like, oh, everyone like always thought that Mars was like bad, or that Saturn was bad, or that Jupiter was like only good. But as we see here, that's just like not true. And so we have Saturn producing like nobility of spirit, lofty individuals, but they're arrogant, right? So it's like good, but it comes through Saturn, so it can be like maybe tainted or something like that, or like laced with difficulties. But if Saturn is in the ascendant degree by night, this is where we get like the much more straightforward malefic qualities. And so just another note on the activities around water. I think part of this is also that like seafaring used to just be like incredibly dangerous and very difficult, right? So always worn out by tedious work. It was not like a reliable trade. Like you could get lost, you could get into a storm, you could be attacked by enemy ships or whatever. And it represented like the boundary between where people lived and where it was like very dangerous to go. And it's also just like this dark thing where there's things like lurking in the depths, like you can't see through it, which is just very interesting. So next we have Abu Mashar. Excuse me, by the way, I'm sick from this mold. So says, quote, his nature is cooling, drying. This is interesting. And this is, I have it listed at the end, is Charles Obert has a book called Saturn Through the Ages, where he just looks at the significations of Saturn through many more books than I do. And it's really interesting. At the beginning of the tradition, we see Saturn as being cool and wet, or cold and wet. And now we see it from like in the Hellenistic tradition, it starts to kind of shift. But from the medieval tradition, like firmly onward, we see cooling and drying, which is just something to take note of. Where, like, remember, Valens, I can't remember where it said that. Of illnesses, he's indicative of those that arise from coldness and moisture. We're not going to see that going forward as much. So cooling and drying, black bile, dark, harsh in coarseness, but sometimes is cooling and moist, right? So here we see it's primarily cooling and drying, but sometimes it's cooling and moist, so it indicates heavy, stinking air. So like if you've ever been to like a swamp or like the dump when it's humid, right? Something like that, it's just like gross and like oppressive and like overwhelmingly wet and like foul smelling. That would be Saturn. And he is of much eating, sincere in his affection, and indicates works of moisture, plowing, farming, the masters of villages, the cultivation of lands, building, waters and rivers, the appraising of things, the apportioning of lands, wealth, and an abundance of assets, those working with their hands, and avarice, harsh poverty, lowly people, travel on the seas, excuse me, a long absence from the homeland, and distant bad journeys, and delusion, malice, resentment, cunning, stratagems, deception, treachery, harm, anguish, solitude, and little company with people, putting on airs, lack of restraint, haughtiness, conceit, boasting, those who enslave the people, managers for the Sultan, and every work done with evil, coercion, injustice, and anger. And fighters, chains, confinement, stocks, and imposing restriction, and sincerity of speech, deliberateness being unhurried, understanding, tested actions, actrians, examination, stubbornness, much thought, profundity, insistence, sticking to a single path, hardly ever getting angry, but if he did get angry, he would be not able to control himself, and not loving the good for anyone. And he indicates old men and the weighty among people, fear, hardships, anxieties, sorrows, dejection, confusion, complications, difficulty, adversity, restriction, the ancestors, the dead, inheritances, lamentation, orphanhood, put that twice, old things, grandfathers, fathers, older brothers, slaves, stable workers, misers, people who have a bad reputation, disgraced people, robbers, grave diggers, murdakshas. I probably didn't say that right. If anyone knows what that is, let me know. Body snatchers, tanners, people who make things faulty, sorcerers, masters of social unrest, the riffraff, eunuchs, long thought but little speech, the knowledge of secrets, and no one knows what is in his mind, nor does he disclose it to anyone, being acquainted with every abstruse matter, and it indicates leading an ascetic life and the devout people of religious communities. So we have a large number of things here. We see again these things like poverty, lowliness, and just like the burden that carries, like literally physically, but also socially. So people who are once again cast out, they're at the limits of society, they're at the margins, they're at the bottom, and they're like looked down on, right? So that would be the sort of like children of Saturn, you could say. Also interesting that it's wealth and an abundance of assets. So it can be kind of both sometimes in different contexts, but often you will see Saturn, like I said, with, I think it was with Valens, where it's like, you'll see it through like administration of other people's things. Oftentimes you'll see associations with like landlords. So, and this is kind of interesting. Sometimes you see this with malefics where it's like gain from a malefic in someone's chart will come through harm to others. So that would be something like a landlord, someone who's like profiting off of the land, right? So like farm share, like slave owners, those kinds of things can also be Saturn. But it's interesting that Saturn can be this lowliness, but it can also be this like cultivated status, because Saturn a lot of times will be associated with people who have like lots of knowledge through experience, or lots of like mystical wisdom, or like knowledge of secrets, that kind of thing. So that can be kind of like the good or bad of Saturn. Saturn can just be like outright evil, stinky maliciousness, or it can be this like cultivated but like harsh knowledge of things, right? Through living for a very long time and understanding how things work. So that's probably good for Avamashar. He has a lot in there. And just also like old things in general, you'll see that. And so it's kind of the same thing where in old people, you'll see like nasty old people, or you'll see old people who understand what it's like to live for a long time and like have lots of wisdom, that kind of thing. So next is the final traditional author. We have Lilly from the 1600s in England. Says, manners and actions when well dignified. Then he is profound in imagination, in his acts severe, in words reserved, in speaking and giving very spare, in labor patient, in arguing or disputing grave, in obtaining the goods of this life studious and solicitous, in all manner of actions austere. So that's just a lot of what we said before. Saturn, when he is well placed, is profound, deep, still, patient, hardworking, austere, right? So that would be Saturn when he's well dignified. When he's ill dignified, so this would be like in its fall, in a bad house, that kind of thing. Then he is envious, covetous, jealous, and mistrustful, timorous, sordid, outwardly dissembling, sluggish, suspicious, stubborn, a contemner of women, a close liar, malicious, murmuring, never contented, ever repining. So this would be someone who's like I always think of like Wormtongue, Grima Wormtongue from Lord of the Rings, where he's just kind of like lusting after what the hell's her name? I've been watching these movies lately. What the hell is her name? Eowyn. I think he's like lusting after her and like whispering in the king's ear and like lying and like just like gross and like dressed all in black, never contented, malicious murmuring, repining. I think repining means like complaining. So kind of like that, just like this super like slippery, like lacks morals kind of person. So Saturn in traditional astrology will be the domicile ruler of Capricorn and Aquarius. This is notably different from modern astrology, where Saturn is either not mentioned or is mentioned as like a co-ruler, but is almost always put in like a very secondary place to Uranus as the ruler of Aquarius. Saturn is exalted in Libra. It's the diurnal ruler of the airy triplicity and the cooperative ruler of the fiery triplicity. And as we've been saying, many of Saturn's significations come from him being the slowest and darkest, like dimmest planet, and standing opposite to the luminaries in the Thema Mundi. So as sort of like an anti-luminary, you could say, Saturn indicates darkness, ignorance, madness, secret things, cruelty, poverty, lowliness, outsiders, decay, and death. So this is, again, everything that would be like opposite the lights, which are like the source of life. They bring it into being, they connect it with itself, they expound it and reproduce it. They bring like truth, light, understanding, nobility, courage, confidence, strength, wealth, power, all of those kinds of things. And Saturn will give everything else. So again, darkness, illusion, ignorance, lies, old age and decay, right? So like a lot of times you'll see like the sun and the moon are like the peak of light and life, right? And indicate its growth, right? With the sun and moon being exalted in spring, reaching their domicile in summer. Saturn exalts at the turning of the tide downward towards the dark half of the year and sees this domicile in the darkest and coldest portion. So Saturn will also indicate like limits, boundaries. So that would be things like coastlines, but again, the boundaries of life, the boundaries of what a person is capable of enduring, right? And the limits of what they're able to do. And it's really interesting too. This is like an image of Saturn or Kronos eating the children, right? So Saturn, as we grow older, we are devoured by Saturn. Saturn like eats its own children and kills life. It's very interesting imagery. So just in general, Saturn is a lot more like complicated in traditional astrology, as things tend to be. And so there's a lot more like nuance to a lot of Saturn's interpretations in traditional astrology, where he can grant good things such as wisdom and like a forcefulness, but also it can grant wealth through things like having properties or administrating for other people. But it can also grant sort of the stereotypical bad things, as we've been talking about. But there's a lot more of like Saturn in different conditions can grant different things based on the nature of the chart, based on its configurations, based on its house placement, its sign placement, its phase status, all these different things that are in a lot of ways very absent in modern astrology. So first up, and again, not to paint modern astrology as like this bad thing. It is based on an incomplete understanding of the traditional sources that now we have and can understand. The traditional sources should be reevaluated, I think. So, and I'm not going to sit here and be like modern astrology doesn't work, because I've had readings that are very insightful. So Stephen Forrest in The Inner Sky in 1984, I believe, says that the function of Saturn is the development of self-discipline, the development of self-respect, the development of faith in one's destiny, and making peace with solitude. Excuse me. Its dysfunction is depression, melancholy, cynicism, coldness, unresponsiveness, time serving. So this kind of like attitude of like, oh, I just gotta like get through it, and then like, but there's no life in it, right? Drudgery, lack of imagination, suppression of emotion, and materialism. The key questions for Saturn will be: in what area of my life must I learn to act alone? And where will a lack of self-discipline lead most quickly to sorrow? Where will my ability to dream and have faith be most severely tested? He goes on to say, Saturn teaches one virtue above all others: self-discipline. That is the key to understanding the symbol. Like Mars, the other so-called malefic Saturn seeks to focus the will, to teach us that most elusive of arts, how to do exactly as we please, how to make our intentions dominant over our fears, our laziness, and our emotions. Jupiter is the planet of faith, but in a sense, it is Saturn that truly deserves that title. Jupiter gives the feeling of faith, but often by supporting us with 1,000 crutches. Sure, I've got faith. Life is great. Look at my bank account, at my bank book, my sexy mate, my brand new Mercedes. And this is a little further in the section. Or no, maybe it's not. This is just the next paragraph. Saturn's approach to faith is not like that. He takes away the crutches. He shows us darkness, impossibility, and certain defeat. Then he asks, do you still have faith? Again, this faith has nothing to do with religion. It is faith in life, in oneself, in our dreams and visions, in our ideals. It is faith in the idea that we have a destiny, and only if those visions can stand alone, unassisted in the face of absolute impossibility, can we say that we truly have faith. Until then, we are still riding with training wheels. So Saturn here, when it's turned inward, right, because most modern astrology is focused on the life of the mind, the life of the soul, the personality. When Saturn is turned inwards, it becomes the like inner critic or the inner disciplinarian, and it seeks to, like he says, focus the will and make it into something like hard and effective. Like he says, sort of similar to Mars. How much can we endure before we give up? How much are we willing to sacrifice and give up before we decide it's too much and throw out our dreams or whatever? So you see, it's a little bit different, and I'm always a little confused on like the function versus dysfunction, if this means like the person should be able to achieve this, or if the like conditions in the chart will make it so that they can't or whatnot. But we see that like the function of Saturn would be the development of self-discipline, self-respect. So things that are help someone to endure hard times in life, making peace with solitude. And the dysfunction would be like giving into depression or like feeling sorry for yourself, or like lacking self-respect, or suppressing your emotions. So that would be Stephen Forrest. I do like this book a lot. I actually liked his section on Saturn, and it is less frustrating to me as a section of Mars. But I think this is really the main difference in most of modern astrology, is that all the planets are sort of turned inward, and instead of relating to inner and outer things and how they correlate, it's related to psychological states. Right? So Richard Tarnas in Cosmos and Psyche says Saturn is the principle of limit, structure, contraction, constraint, necessity, hard materiality, concrete manifestation, time, the past, tradition, age, maturity, mortality, the endings of things, gravity and gravitas, weightiness, that which burdens, binds, challenges, fortifies, and deepens, the tendency to confine and restrict, to separate, divide, and define, to cut and shorten, to negate and oppose, to strengthen and forge through tension and resistance, to rigidify, to repress, to maintain a conservative and strict authority, to experience difficulty, decline, deprivation, defect, and deceit, and deficit, defeat, failure, loss, alienation, the labor of existence, suffering, old age, death, the weight of the past, the workings of fate, character, karma, the consequences of past action, error and guilt, punishment, retribution, imprisonment, the sense of no exit, pessimism, inferiority, inhibition, isolation, oppression, and depression, the impulse and capacity for discipline and duty, order, solitude, concentration, conciseness, thoroughness, and precision, discrimination and objectivity, restraint and patience, endurance, responsibility, seriousness, authority, wisdom, the harvest of time, effort, and experience, the concern with consensus reality, factual concreteness, conventional forms and structures, foundations, boundaries, solidity and stability, security and control, rational organization, efficiency, law, right and wrong, judgment, the superego, the dork. I think it's supposed to say the dark. The dork. The dark, cold, heavy, dense, dry, old, slow, Distant, the senex, so like the old person, old man. That's where you get senator from, actually, interestingly enough. Kronos, the stern father of the gods. So he's the best. Karnas just kills it every time. So we see the difficult parts of Saturn are the weight, the heaviness, the darkness, the consequences, right? The rigidity, the repression, the conservative nature, the strict authority, the hierarchies, sort of, like the weight of tradition and history, the limits of what people are able to achieve given the weights of history and tradition, given the context of culture and society, given the constraints of life and death, and maximum you're getting 100 years. What can you do in that time with the abilities that you're given your social status, given your historical moment, given your cultural period? And then we have some of the more positive sides, which would be restraint, patience, endurance, responsibility, seriousness, authority, wisdom, the harvest of time, organization, control, security, stability, law, right? So we have things that are like heavy and restricting and bad, but we also have things that are heavy and restricting and good, like the ability to be patient and wait, and the ability for the old to influence the young in a way that is like healthy, right? It's like if you have a child and just let them do whatever they want, that's not good. If you have a child and you're way overbearing and way harsh and there's no freedom, that's bad. You need like a controlled freedom, right? So that would be sort of the good and bad of Saturn. And the senex is a good image as well, like just this image of like what are old people, like what are they here for, like what's the archetype of old people, what do they do in society, what do they do in their families? Think of the image of like a matriarch or a patriarch in the way that everything kind of revolves around them, but it's not through this like violent control. It's through this like, oh, we have this respect for this loving authority who knows what's happening and has been here for a long time and understands the traditions and is passing them on, right? You can also have the negative version of that through like the crankiness of old people and their, whatever. So the last source that we have is Bren Butler. So he says that he has principles. I did not proofread this very well. So he has this little section on like principles. He gives a little snippet, and then it's a little longer section. So he says he's like a positive and a negative kind of thing. So incarnation in material form, real world concerns and responsibilities, work and structure, time and boundaries, qualities of maturity and wisdom, patience and forbearance. Oops, God, excuse me. I'm making the grossest noises today. So the negative would be, or the difficult, or the whatever, forces of constriction and hardening, growth, boundaries and separation, problems and challenges, repression and defensiveness, fearful enslavement to the past. Goes on to say, the archetypal complex related to Saturn governs the small r reality principle, bringing order, structure, and consistency to human life. It also represents the inevitable sorrows and challenges of material incarnation. Reminding us of the birth process and our vulnerable mortality, Saturn underlies our fearful tendencies to armor and defend ourselves from past and future pain, with a consequent hardening, tightening, and limiting effect on our psyches. Sorry. The struggles associated with Saturn also lead to many positive traits, however, including responsibility and integrity, grounded humility, hard work, and patience. Spiritual opening seems to demand that we face our limits and experience the ego reduced to a meaningless speck. I really didn't proofread this well enough. Which then paradoxically allows us to reawaken to the universal mind and cosmic consciousness. During major transits of Saturn, we are more likely to feel the humbling and painful but necessary parts of this process. Spiritually, Saturn represents our sense of the divine as strict, judging, and punishing, as keeping score, and as exacting retribution for our disobedience and mistakes. It manifests through our cautious needs to obey and toe the line, to act with utmost care and responsibility, and above all, not to hurt anyone. In one of Saturn's most extreme forms, when we are reliving the no-exit stage of birth, which is Groff's basic perinatal matrix 2, as Saturn is recognized, we may see the universe as a soulless machine, cardboard facade, or inhuman torture chamber. In this challenging state, people selectively see the worst aspects of human existence, a litany of unending wars, genocides, famines, plagues, droughts, and ecological catastrophes. In more everyday forms, people may be unable to recognize any kind of higher awareness outside of the human brain, or they may perceive a universal consciousness but see it as unreachably remote and separate. So I really like this whole section. It really, I think it says a lot about the sort of goals of modern astrology and their sort of spiritual aims and their efforts to understand and make intelligible the sort of inner life of the native. And so Saturn here is, and if people have experienced like severe depression, they know what this is like, where it's like things just seem kind of hopeless, mundane, boring, and just kind of lifeless. Like I think a lot of times people will think of like a severe depression as this very dramatic event of like no one cares about me, like I hate everything, everyone hates me, that kind of a thing. But a lot of times what it really is just this like very overwhelming, intense boredom and like apathy rather than feelings of like active sadness or something like that. And so I think he really does a good job of explaining that in this section where, we see the universe as a soulless machine, a cardboard facade, see aspects of human existence as a litany of unending wars, genocides, famines. It's this kind of like things are going to fall apart anyway, so why even bother? That can be Saturn in a very difficult but sometimes necessary sense to, becoming a mature person to understand, sort of like a dark night of the soul kind of a thing. So that would be Ren Butler. That's our final source. So Saturn in modern astrology retains a lot of its meaning as boundaries and limits. But again, everything is kind of turned inward. So instead of thinking of like coastlines and like the atmosphere or like the limits of time and space or the limits of a human life, we think of like the limits of our effort or the limits of our endurance or the limits of our discipline or something like that. It can also indicate like inner darkness, like we were just saying, of like depression, melancholy, despair, which are these very like still states rather than Mars would be like Saturn can also be like fear and that kind of a thing, but Mars would be like terror or anger or frustration or agitation, right? It's these like quickening, heating emotions, whereas depression is slowing and cooling, and it's a lot like death, right? It's similar to more so than like Martian type emotions. So Saturn again also represents death, right? It's cold, it's wet or dry, right? And this is a point that really gets expounded in Charles Obert's book, which again I'll mention towards the end. Saturn becomes a lot of times something to be transcended and pushed past. So there's a lot of like, these are the limits, let's like punch through them. And when we've done that, then we've like mastered Saturn or something like that. And it's an idea that is kind of difficult for me to articulate, but it's this thing that's like baked into modern astrology, this idea of spiritual progress or something like that, that we need to like push past Saturn and like get to Uranus, get to like the freedom and the like agency and all this kind of thing. And that if there are things that are restricting and like feel like they're like punishing us or feels like they are too tight or heavy, then those are bad and we need to work against them, right? And you do see that in Stephen Forrest, where it's dysfunctional if Saturn produces depression, melancholy, cynicism, coldness, right? Rather than that just being the nature of the planet itself, this is a dysfunction of the planet, something that we don't like, right? But if we can use Saturn to develop self-discipline and self-respect and sort of transcend the nature of Saturn, then that's functional, right? It's very interesting. And something that I personally find pretty like distasteful. And I think a lot of this comes through with Saturn also being, you remove Aquarius from Saturn and give it to Uranus, you lose the brighter, more like noble maybe aspects of Saturn because you're taking away its preferred domicile and you're leaving it only with Earth. So finally, the Saturn return is something that happens when you're 28 to 30 for the first time, and then again when you're like 58, 60. And then finally, if you live long enough, when you're like early 90s. And so the Saturn return is this concept that has become very popular, and it's where Saturn returns to the position it was in the birth chart. And it basically indicates this period of like very intense like maturation, and it can be very harsh where, people will be like I was looking at a chart the other night with a friend of mine where this person had addiction problems, and then he had Mars and Saturn in the fourth house in Capricorn, and this is a period where he becomes sober. He like gets clean from whatever he was using, and so this is something it's like very difficult and intense, and like it's like this inner struggle, but it is eventually profitable, right? Because he's two dignified malefics in the fourth. So again, this is like something really good coming from malefics, but it's very difficult, and it involves this period of darkness and pain and disorientation and like grieving and reliving trauma and all these kinds of things. And so often the Saturn return can indicate like and this is a lot of times depending on the natal chart and not always based on like the person's effort, which is kind of another thing that I really disagree with in a lot of modern astrology, is that like our efforts are very, very important, but oftentimes not enough to alter the basic like state of the natal chart. And if there are really difficult things indicated on the natal chart, it's not always a dysfunction, but it's just like a fact of life, which might be my malefic chart. But so the Saturn return can oftentimes be like this period of intense difficulty where things are kind of swept away and you're like cast out into maturity for the first time, and you have to really understand like, what is my life? What am I trying to do here? What do I need to do in order to survive and make any progress? Sometimes it can be like an elevation to a new status, which remember that Saturn is related to both of those things, like lowliness and high status. Sometimes I'll hear people talk about it in a very like moralizing way, where it's like, if you did your homework, then Saturn will be good to you in your Saturn return, and it's just like not always true. And so this is I don't think I listed it at the end, but there's a book called The Greatness of Saturn, which I think a lot of people have read, but it's a really interesting book where it's this guy is like goes through, it's not a Saturn return, it's something else. It's the Sati, which is the moon, Saturn on the sign in front of the moon, with the moon, and after it's like a 7-year period that in the Indian tradition is said to be very difficult, and it's kind of similar-ish to a Saturn return. And it's just the way that this guy's life gets like destroyed and then rebuilt. And it removes a lot of the like moralizing character of it, where it's like Saturn, by coming in and like giving you difficult circumstances and giving you despair and cynicism and coldness, is not always bad. It's not always like something that you need to be like, okay, I need to like stop this right now. I need to like get self-discipline. That's not always the case. It's a lot of times Saturn needs you to be patient and listen and wait and slow down and like just kind of work and like kind of drudge up what needs to be drudged up. That's like, I think, a good word for Saturn is. And a lot of times you'll have this in the house that Saturn's in for 2.5, 3 years at a time. So it's kind of like drudging up whatever needs to be taken into account, witnessed, seen, made visible, things that have been hidden, that kind of a thing. So that's it for today. That's the Saturn talk. So for Works Cited, we have Chris Brennan's Hellenistic Astrology. As always, Firmicus's Mathesis, Charles Oberst's The Classical Seven Planets, which is where I got Abu Mashar and Lily. We have Stephen Forrest's Inner Sky, Richard Tarnas' Cosmos and Psyche, Ren Butler's Archetypal Universe, Charles Obert's Saturn Through the Ages, Between Time and Eternity. And then this, I haven't read this book, and I've just heard a lot of people talk about it, and I see it on bookshelves all the time, but Liz Green's Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil. Very modern astrology book. So if you're into that, read it. If you're not, you should also read it. But it is very demonstrative from the excerpts that I read through this Charles Obert Saturn book of this view that Saturn is something that we need to kind of master and transcend, which I don't think is always wrong. I just don't think it's, I think it's something that a lot of people pick up when they're learning modern astrology that they don't really think about. And it's kind of just like taken as a fact that we need to progress, right? And then after that, there's that, I didn't write it here, but that book, The Greatness of Saturn by Robert Svoboda. I don't know if I'm remembering his name right. And then there's these astrology podcast episodes, episode 24, 64, 84, 135, and 322. There's a couple more. There's like Saturn in Sag retrospective and Saturn in Capricorn retrospective, and these kinds of things. So I hope you enjoyed this. Saturn was rising as I'm filming this, so I hope it pleases the Dark Lord. So I will see you all next time. Thank you for watching.